What if you could quit work at 35 and spend the next 50 years doing whatever you want? I used to think that was the dream, and then I looked at what actually happens to people who try it. The number that stopped me was this. Research tracking early retirees over a decade found that more than 60% ran into serious financial trouble within 8 years. Not a little tight. Broke back to work. Some in worse shape than when they started. And here's the part that genuinely unsettled me. The ones who failed were not reckless. They were careful. They had plans. They had spreadsheets. So why did the math that looked so clean on paper fall apart so completely in real life? There is a hidden mechanism almost nobody talks about when the retire early conversation comes up, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. A few years ago, I built my own version of the Retire at 35 plan. I had a savings rate, a target number, a timeline. I had read the blogs, watched the videos, done the projections, and I felt genuinely smart about it. Then I started digging into what actually happened to people who had crossed the finish line, people who hit their number, left their jobs, and lived the life I was planning. And what I found was uncomfortable. Not because the goal is impossible, but because most people, including me at the time, were solving the wrong problem entirely. We were optimizing for the moment of quitting, not for the 30 or 40 or 50 years that come after it. When I finally understood the real structure of what early retirement requires, the version I had planned would not have worked. And that quiet recognition that I had nearly walked into the same trap is exactly why I am making this video. If this kind of financial clarity is what you come here for, subscribe and turn on notifications. There is more of this coming every week. Let me give you an analogy that reframed everything for me. Imagine you are crossing a very long bridge. You spend years preparing for the walk, checking your shoes, packing your bag, calculating the distance. You step onto the bridge feeling ready. What you did not fully plan for, the wind, not a storm. Just the ordinary daily wind that wears on you over time. Early retirement is that bridge. The preparation almost everyone focuses on is getting onto the bridge, saving enough, hitting the number, leaving the job. But the bridge itself, the decades of living without a salary, without the structure of work, without the psychological and financial buffers, most people never notice until they are gone. That is where the real challenge lives. The wind is not dramatic. It is relentless. And most early retirement plans are built for the moment of stepping onto the bridge, not for the crossing. Here is the first number I want you to sit with. The most widely shared early retirement formula says you need 25 times your annual expenses saved. Withdraw 4% per year. Done. For someone spending $40,000 per year, that is $1 million. That sounds like a lot. And for a traditional retirement at 65, the 4% rule holds up reasonably well historically. But watch what happens when you extend this timeline. Stretch the retirement from 20 years to 50 years. Because retiring at 35 means you may need this money to last until 85 or beyond. That same research that gave us the 4% rule also showed something most people quietly skip over. At a 50-year horizon, the safe withdrawal rate drops closer to 3.3%. That single adjustment raises the target from 1 million to 1.2 million for the same lifestyle. Not ruinous, but not what most people are planning for either. And that is just the first gap. Stay with me, because the second one is significantly larger. This is the mechanism that breaks more early retirement plans than any other single factor. It is called sequence of returns risk. Imagine you retire with your full target number saved. Year 1, the market drops 30%. You still need to eat, pay rent, cover healthcare. So you sell investments to cover your expenses at the worst possible prices. Those shares you sold at the bottom are gone. They cannot recover for you even when the market comes back. Because you needed the money, you locked in the loss permanently. Now your portfolio is smaller, recovering from a lower base. While you continue withdrawing from it, the hole gets deeper even as the market climbs. I ran through historical periods where someone retiring at 35 with a perfectly reasonable plan hit a rough first decade and never recovered, not because the market stayed bad forever, but because the early withdrawals during the bad years did permanent structural damage. The sequence matters as much as the average return. And here is what makes this specifically dangerous for early retirees. A retiree at 65 who hits a bad sequence has maybe a 15-year window of risk. Someone who retires at 35 could face that same bad sequence, with 50 years ahead of them. That exposure gap is the part almost nobody models when they run their retire early projections. If you're finding this useful, hit like. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who need to see exactly this kind of breakdown. The Retire at 35 plan has a third failure point that almost nobody factors in, and it is the most quietly devastating of all. Healthcare. In most countries, employer-sponsored healthcare is the invisible subsidy that makes working life financially bearable. The moment you leave employment before retirement age, that subsidy disappears. In the United States, a healthy 35-year-old purchasing private health insurance can expect to pay somewhere between $500 and $800 per month as a baseline. By 55, that same person is looking at $1,200 to $1,800 per month or more before any serious claims. Over a 50-year retirement, healthcare costs alone, even under optimistic assumptions, could consume $200,000 to $400,000 or beyond. Almost no early retirement calculator I have ever seen asks you to model this with the same rigor it applies to investment returns. And there is something even harder to quantify sitting underneath the healthcare number. Life changes, divorce, a dependent parent, a child with needs you did not anticipate, a business that fails, a rental property that empties. The early retirement plan built on a spreadsheet is built for the life you have today. Real life is not that cooperative. Now let me show you what the real numbers look like when these three mechanisms are accounted for together. The standard formula says $1 million for someone spending $40,000 per year. Adjusting for the 50-year horizon, $1.2 million. Adding a conservative healthcare reserve, $1.5 million. Building in a sequence of returns buffer, the honest target sits somewhere between $1.6 and $2 million. The difference between what most people are targeting and what the structure actually requires is not a rounding error. It is the entire difference between a plan that works for 50 years and one that runs into serious trouble by year 8. Here's what I actually took from all of this. First, the 4% rule is not wrong. It is just not designed for a 50-year retirement. Know the version of the rule that applies to your timeline, not the headline number. Second, sequence of returns risk is the most structurally dangerous element of early retirement. The defense is not hoping for a good first decade. It is building a specific buffer, cash, short-term bonds, flexible spending that protects your portfolio during early bad years. Third, model healthcare costs as a full line item, not an afterthought. For many people, healthcare alone will be their second largest expense in early retirement, and ignoring it is the single fastest way to turn a plan that looks sound into one that quietly fails. The Retire at 35 dream is not a trap because the goal is bad. It is a trap because most people are solving for the wrong finish line. The people who actually make early retirement work ask not how much do I need to quit, but what does this money have to survive? That question changes every number in the plan, and seeing the gap between those two versions is the only way to build something that actually holds. The Retire at 35 dream does not fail because people dream too big. It fails because they plan for the finish line instead of the 50 years that follow it.